Welcome to the IAE seminar, both to the people in the room here today and also to the people who are with us online. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, who is Professor LeRoy Poff. LeRoy is a professor at Colorado State University, but also has a partial appointment as a distinguished professor here at University of Canberra, which I think is about 5 years now. He's had that association with the university. And during that time, he's been successful with ARC discovery and has continued to publish prolifically, as he has for much of his career. LeRoy did his master's at Indiana University in Bloomington. He then did his PhD at Colorado State University and eventually moved back to Colorado State University as tenured academic. Most of his work has focused in the area of ecohydrology or hydroecology, one of the two variants of those two things. And he's published what's considered the seminal paper in that area, which is called the natural flow regime, and it has attracted more than 7,500 citations. He's published widely, including multiple times in Nature and Science, and he has an H-index of 87, which if you don't familiar with H-indexes, that's high. So that's a big number. He's been recognised in multiple ways and awards. Just to give a subset of them here, he got the Award of Excellence in 2019 from the Society for Freshwater Science, and he's also been awarded fellowships by the Ecological Society of America in 2016, the American Association for the Advancement of Science in 2012, and as a fellow of the Aldo Leopold Leadership Program in 2004. So LeRoy has always been at the forefront of what we do in terms of managing flow, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from him today. So over to you, LeRoy.
Thank you, Ross. Can you hear me through the microphone okay? All right, great. Well, it's a great pleasure to be here. It took some effort to break through the COVID resistance to get here, but I'm glad I am, and hoping for a hiccup-free ride home. I'll be here for another week. Be happy to meet with anyone during that time if you would like to chat. So today I wanted to, despite my work in environmental flows, I wanted to talk about something that's a little more basic science and slightly different that I think is a sort of a fun story and an interesting story, and one that we learned a lot from by virtue of the opportunity to do research in a very sort of special, under special conditions. And I will get to that. So what I want to talk about is how species persist in highly disturbed stream ecosystems when an extreme event occurs, which even amps up the disturbance and potentially can lead to species elimination. So this work, see, it's going to work or not. This laser pointer works. Let me try this again. I don't know. There we go. This work was actually published back in 2018 in the journal Ecology Letters. And you can see it's about extreme streams, as we called it. Okay, and we're going to look at population level responses of aquatic organisms to extreme events and genomic responses. This was a multi-investigator project. You can see many investigators here. This was funded by the National Science Foundation as a special project that I'll come back to in a moment. So extreme events, as many of us, and particularly you guys in particular, understand, are increasing in frequency and magnitude, and they can modify, sometimes change the trajectory of both ecosystem functions and communities composition and species persistence. So they also modify potentially evolutionary trajectories of populations. They can have long-lasting effects. And, you know, the extreme event magnitude and frequency are increasing. So we don't understand very well what the effects of extreme events are on populations and communities because we don't really have the data to measure that many times. Now, this is a report from 2013 by a bunch of meteorologists and so forth, looking at extreme events around the world. So this is, 8-9 years ago now. Right here in Colorado, there is an extreme rainfall event that made it into this report. There wasn't a clear enough attribution to climate change at the time, but there was some, it probably was climate change induced. It created a very severe disturbance across the landscape. There are other examples, of course, that we're familiar with of both fire and flood. And Australia seems to be particularly blessed with extreme events. So it's really important that we start understanding how these extreme events may modify communities and populations in order to try to manage appropriately, which is a big challenge. This particular event in Colorado, which I'll describe in some detail here, caused a lot of damage to property, loss of life, and it really reamed out and sort of really heavily disturbed the stream systems that were affected by this heavy rainfall. And so the question we came to this project with was how do benthic species that live in this naturally disturbed environment persist during such extreme disturbances, okay? And how might these extreme disturbances affect sort of evolutionary change, if you will, of resident populations? Now, let me start by defining a disturbance. There's a lot of debate in the ecological literature about this, but a sort of a settled definition is that it's an event, a physical event, that causes organism mortality and or resource change. Okay? So that's an event, and a disturbance is an event, and of course a disturbance regime is the temporal pattern of disturbance events that can be characterized by things like magnitude, frequency, duration, and timing or predictability. Now, where I live in northern Colorado, we have the disturbance regime or the flow regime has very striking characteristics. It typically, magnitude that varies from unit. This is the graph is showing on the x-axis the month of the year, so fall, autumn, out through summer, and the year is a short record here of about 10 years or so. And then the magnitude of flow in the river, the cubic meters per second. This is about 7,000 cubic feet per second. That's about 200 cumex. And so you see each year we have sort of flows typically in the range of 3,000 to 4,000 CFS, but and they occur in sort of with pretty good predictability when the snow melts in June. And so there's this window of time, sort of narrow window of time when disturbances come along, okay, high flow disturbances. And in September of 2013, there was this really aberrant event. It was a rainfall event long after the snow had melted that created this extreme high flow, at least 200 cumex, and the instantaneous flow was probably closer to 300. So this is a river in the town where I live. This is characteristic of what happened all along in the entire region. So what we see about that particular event is that it has a very high magnitude and that the timing, the predictability is out of sync with sort of what the regular seasonal timing would be, okay? So this got our interest up quite a bit. And we were, wondering from a theoretical point of view, what this high magnitude sort of non-seasonal event might do in terms of restructuring benthic stream dwelling, bottom dwelling organisms, species, populations, and communities. All right, so here's a picture of one of the more severely disturbed stream beds. You see that basically the canopy's been opened up. There's a lot of material, coarse material on the stream bed that's been moved, crushing organisms that live on the bottom, probably. And the organisms that we'll talk about today are these aquatic insects, okay, and they're common, they're abundant, they're speciose. We probably have 40 species in this stream alone. And easy to sample, but they'll take a lot of time to identify in the lab and work with the data. So that's why we had technicians and master students helping out. Always a good idea. So during the flood, do these organisms survive the moving stream bed? Okay, and can we explain if there are differences in persistence? Can we explain those? Well, of course, this begs the question: what about before the flood? What was the conditions like before the flood? And that's a question that's a big challenge for most of us because we don't have conveniently pre-disturbance, pre-extreme event baseline data. Well, we were very lucky in this case. And this is the area where we're talking about. Talk about the study. It's in the Front Range of Colorado. So we're looking west here, going from sort of the Great Plains at about 1,500 meters up to, whoops, what's that? Wow. Up to, a high of 4,200 meters continental divide. And we studied in this band of sort of 2,000 meters up to 3,500 meters or so, okay? And this is a pretty steep gradient. This occurs over, this is very steep mountain terrain. So rainfall that falls on this terrain will be concentrated quickly and have a lot of power to move things around. Now, fortuitously, we had a previous study that was in this area. So let me orient you here. So if we go back here, here's Fort Collins, where I live. And this event that I'm going to talk about, which occurred over this region, was literally in my backyard. Okay, so that was a convenient opportunity. And we're going to be looking at, so here we have the North Fort Collins, and we have Boulder, and Denver's down over here. And if we look at this figure here, we have Fort Collins up here and Boulder. So we're looking north-south this direction, lowland up to high elevations here. And this is 3 different drainages, so it's not so important. But in this previous study we were actually, in 2011, we had sampled 27 streams in this region as indicated by the dots. And the motivation behind this study was basically a larger project to compare temperate montane systems to tropical montane systems in Colorado and Ecuador along mountain elevation fronts, and to look mostly at the response of these insects to thermal variation. Okay, and this is a project that has sort of been continued and expanded on by Ben and Ross, myself as a discovery grant here in Australia, along with B and Jolene, are doing excellent work collecting and analyzing the data. So that previous study was done primarily to look at temperature effects. Now, but we did sample all the streams in Colorado, 27 of them, and in Ecuador down here, which I won't talk about. We looked at things like environmental data. We collected insect larvae from using different techniques. We could identify them to morphotaxon and calculate things like diversity and so forth. We also collected adult insects at some sites, and adults are the definitive form in which you identify species typically. So by collecting the adults, we knew what species we were dealing with, and we could look at the genomic data of those species. Now, this in between our study and in 2013, this extreme event occurred. So again, we're looking at down south, Denver, up north, Fort Collins is up here in the mountains here. And this shows the amount of rain accumulated over a 1-week period, basically in 2013 in September. And that caused streams in this region, many of which we had previously sampled, to experience disturbance events that were in the magnitude of 1 in 50 to 1 in 500 years. So these are, there's a gradient of extreme disturbance. And so that's an interesting setup in order to ask questions about how species and populations respond across these disturbance gradients, particularly when they are sort of extreme in the sense that they are very rare. Notice that a lot of this area is purple and sort of light purple. That represents a range of 432 to 458 approximately millimeters in 1 week over the steep topography. And most of that occurred in a 36-hour period. So there were raging floods, doing a lot of property damage, and made, it was a really big event. So we were fortunate in having had sampled the previous, have sampled sites across that gradient previously to be able to go in and resample those sites. So again, we have north up here, Fort Collins, Boulder down here, so high elevation. And we see here, we've colored in a different color, the rainfall intensity up to these dark red areas up to 400 460 millimeters in the week. Okay, so we can see there's a pretty strong variation, spatial variation in the amount of rainfall that occurred and hence the disturbance. So the National Science Foundation has a really nice program called the Rapid Grants. Basically, if an extreme event or some rare event occurs, you can apply for money to the National Science Foundation. You get a 1 to 2 year project to evaluate the consequences of that extreme event. So we were funded to do that. So we had money to resample 14 of the sites. We selected 14 sites that were across a gradient of that disturbance magnitude, 14 streams. And I will say that these are different elevations. Our original project had been driven by the question of elevation gradients. Okay, so our sites were intentionally distributed across elevation gradients. Not that was really necessarily critical for this study, but that's what we had. We had these sites distributed across elevation gradients and overlain by different disturbance intensities. Now, we recollected, so the event occurred in September of 2013, that's autumn. And then the roads were pretty much inaccessible at that point. A month later, snow was covering the whole area. We were not able to get into our sites again until the following summer, okay, which would be June. So we resampled these sites in June of 2014, which was the same time of year we had sampled previously in 2011. So in terms of the phenologies of the aquatic organisms, they sort of lined up across years. We sampled same techniques, larval insect community composition, and genomic data for the same 6 species that we had previously sampled in 2011. Okay. And the way we characterized these insect species was taxonomic identity. So many of these we could identify certainly to genus or species, and for many of them, we have a pretty good taxonomic understanding of this area. And one member of our team is one of the world leaders in aquatic insect taxonomy. So that was very helpful, particularly when it came to identifying the adults. So we can look at things like change in taxon richness or change in species composition pre and post across this gradient of disturbance. We also looked at species traits. So if you look at this set of species here, you see they differ in terms of things like morphological differences. Some are wormy, some can crawl, some are highly mobile, some can swim. So, we can attribute sort of trait characteristics to these species that we could say these should respond in a certain way to the kind of disturbance that they're experiencing during this extreme event. And one way we characterize these was to talk about resilience and resistance traits, and I'll come back to that in a moment. And then, of course, the other thing is that many of you may not know, or haven't thought about it much, that these aquatic insects are interesting because they have a complex life cycle. Most of their lifetime is spent, your eggs, they're spent in the water, growing and molting up to a certain type of maybe a pupa or to an adult after reproductive tissues are mature. They emerge as an adult, a terrestrial winged adult that could disperse and find mates and relay eggs back in the stream. And so these adults are the ones we can identify as species, and we can do this genomic analysis on those. But these adults also are very important in that they represent a potential refuge from disturbance, right? Because they're out on the landscape, on the vegetation, and the larval population that's remaining in the stream may get severely damaged, but these adults, just a few of them can effectively repopulate a stream because they're quite fecund, okay? Most studies that are published in the literature, for at least for aquatic insects, and there are a lot, characteristically sort of ignore this adult stage, okay? And that's justified in many cases, but in this case, it turns out to be a really interesting part of the story. All right, so we have the team Rapid, that was the people who were hired to do the sampling, and there are four 4 of the women who are part of our team. And the team leader was Casey and her newborn baby, baby Blue, it's called, who was quite involved in the project. And Casey is a very outdoorsy type person, as you can imagine. And, you know, it'd be interesting to talk to baby Blue a few years later and see what kind of formative experiences she has from spending a summer on the hard ground in the you know, in the backcountry with 5 lovely women. Okay, so they, you know, there's some shots from the field, you know, a variety of means to getting to these streams, and some interesting encounters along the way that fortunately no one was, the encounters weren't too close. So these this team did a really excellent job. I mean, they totally dedicated, and, you know, I'm endlessly thankful to them for their hard work. Okay, so we had predictions about what we would find, what we expected to find. One was based on just pure ecological theory, simple ecological theory, that taxa richness will decline as disturbance intensity increases, right? So we have a gradient of disturbance. We have before, pre and post community composition, and we're making the simple prediction that the diversity or the richness will decline as disturbance increases in intensity. That's pretty straightforward. Secondly, we predicted that across that gradient, that taxa possessing certain kinds of traits that might promote resistance or resilience would differentially survive. So taxa lacking those traits would differentially suffer high mortality. And I'll explain the methods behind that in just a moment. And third, for those species that do survive, and there are adults that we can sample after the disturbance, okay, then we predicted that there would be high mortality would cause a genetic bottleneck in neutral loci of allele frequencies, and there would be a loss in genetic richness. And this might be in proportion to the magnitude of the disturbance, okay? So I'll address these now one at a time. And I guess before going forward, anybody have a clarifying question or anything? All right. Okay. My graduate student, Deb Finn, took this picture back in like 2002, and I really love it, so I always use it. And this, of course, for those of you who don't know, that's an American, a US penny. And don't see many of those these days. So, but it's a bit small. Okay, so fortunately, back in 2006, I had published, along with other colleagues, a trait matrix for species all across the US, genera, in terms of a number of traits, so that we could, you know, characterize a benthic sample. We could characterize the species in terms of their traits composition. Okay, so there are different kinds of traits we can attribute to, you know, these taxa. So you can't read this. This says 20 traits in 57 categorical states. So these traits were divided into, we have like life history traits. Okay. And some of these would be important in terms of thinking of surviving floods or other extreme events, like how many generations do they have per year? Are they slow developing? Are they really rapidly developing? Are they always present in the stream? How long do the adults live? And when do they occur? Okay. So there are other traits that can be called mobility traits. And these are important because you can see that these taxa are going to differ a lot in their mobility. And if they're highly mobile, then they have the potential to find some refuge, say during, you know, a bed moving event, and survive. So things like occurring in the drift, that just means they, on like a daily basis, they get up in the water column and move downstream looking for new habitat or more food resources. So that's a very common, some of these drift a lot, some drift not so much. How fast can they crawl? What's their sort of crawling mobility category? And are they able to swim versus, you know, many of these don't swim, some do, can swim with some effectiveness. Morphological traits, they clearly differ morphologically, but one that might be particularly important is like armoring. Okay, is their exoskeleton sclerotized, so that they might avoid being crushed by moving stones. Okay, and then other ecological traits, which we really didn't need much to invoke much of these in the study. So armed with this kind of information, we were able to sort of characterize our taxa in terms of traits that we thought would be good, helpful or not helpful for surviving these extreme disturbance events. So, resilience and resistance have lots of manifestations in the literature. And I'm just going to take sort of a simple ecological perspective of resistance and resilience. Resistance traits are those that would allow the organisms to survive in place during the event, okay? And these might be traits like high mobility, being able to swim or crawl or drift. That might allow them to persist in place. And here's some taxa that do that. Hardening, the sclerotization, like this helmet beetle. It's pretty tough exoskeleton. Silk attachment, these guys, these similar black flies have silk that they can attach their posterior end to rocks so they aren't easily displaced by flows. They could just sort of maybe hang on and survive. Then we have resilience traits, those traits that would allow rapid recolonization and recovery from population declines during disturbance. And these could be things like the presence of a terrestrial adult, okay? If the disturbance occurs when there are adults present and the disturbance abates, then the adults can repopulate the stream, right? And recolonization ability. So, to be able to recolonize from some upstream refuge. Okay. So we can sort of create a little matrix here that helps maybe clarify what we're talking about. So we have sort of a resistance along this axis, low to high, and this is resilience up here, low resilience, high resilience. So in terms of resistance traits, low resistance would be conferred on immobile larvae, right? That we would say they have low resistance. We would predict that. So here are some wormy type taxa. And it turns out that in our study, during the window of time we were studying, there were no, the disturbance occurred, there were no adults of these immobile taxa present in the system. And that's sort of just happenstance, that's the way it was. So these are really, if there were adults, maybe they would have some resilience traits, okay? So high resistance would be attributed to things like this, sclerotized beetles, maybe this simulate black fly, which is very common in the drift, okay? And they have these silk attachments that might help. Interestingly, we saw no adults present for these taxa as well during the sampling time in June, late June. Now over on the resilience side, so these would have low resilience, but so this group right here would have low resilience and low resistance. Here we would have low resilience possibly, but high resistance. Over here we have high resistance and high resilience. And this would be things like mobile larvae that are good at crawling or drifting or potentially good recolonizers. And there are a lot of those. And also, interestingly, for these particular taxa, adults were present in the streams at the time of the disturbance. And this is based on, the presence of adults is based on expert knowledge from one of our collaborators who has spent years, basically his weekends and evenings out stomping around streams collecting adult insects. So, but it is based on expert knowledge, but we have pretty high confidence in his abilities. And so interestingly, these immobile taxa that have low resistance traits also have low resilience because there were no adults present during the summer. So we effectively have low resistance, low resilience group and a higher resistance and high resilience group down here. And then those with high resistance here. Okay, a bit of a busy table, but we're effectively trying to, for each taxon attributed as being, having appropriate resistance or resilience traits that will allow it to persist during the disturbance. And then we made a table that looks like this, where we have sort of our, larval stage. These are resistance traits up here: swimming, drifting, crawling, withstanding crushing. Resilience traits over here, like an adult present or being present in the drift, which means recolonization from upstream refuges potentially. We see we have a group of mobile taxa here, and you can see there they score high on these mobility traits with, let's see, with, this would be the highest ranking category out of 3, so high swimming ability, no crushing resistance for this taxon. So we've got a mixture of traits that, we just considered them we didn't try to quantify differences among traits, but some of these have, high resistance traits, others have high resilience traits. And then we've got a group of immobile taxa down here that are basically wormy and that have very few resistance or resilience traits, except for this, this Elmid beetle, which has a very high resistance to being crushed. Okay. So now we have our a priori expectations based on our species typologies. And so I'm going to come back to that in a moment to test our hypotheses. But a very important question is, how do we quantify disturbance, right? I've sort of asserted that there's this big gradient out there, and that meteorologists have said these are, 1 in 50 to 1 in 500 year events. But how do we actually quantify what happened at a site? And these sites are not gauged. We don't have any hydrologic data. They're small streams, okay? So we're sort of faced with a challenge there, a fun challenge. And probably the most straightforward and easy thing to do, we simply say, let's measure the rainfall and see how much rainfall there was in each site, right? From interpolated mapping. But then that begs the question, is that really a mechanism for a disturbance, okay? And I'll show you in a moment that it's really not. The other thing that we resolved on, and I spent a lot of time talking to geomorphologists and hydrologists about this project because, it required more sort of physical knowledge about the systems and how they respond than I had in my head. And I wanted to be, sure that we were making the right approach. So we ended up, and we were interested in just getting at bed movement, right? And there are a couple of ways to do that. One is if we could know how much the channel actually moved, and that would be like a direct measure of bed movement. The other way is to estimate using, some simple equations and some cross-sectional, measures of width and depth and particle size to calculate something that's called like excess shear stress, which is a measure of the ability, the potential for the bed to move given a certain volume of water. And we went down that road, and it was a lot of fun, but we ended up not using those data because it was just not as explanatory as this other approach, which is to actually calculate bed movement or estimate it directly. And I'll talk about that in just a moment. So rainfall, we see across this elevation gradient from lowland to highland that there is basically no clear pattern of rainfall variation. So this whole region was hit really hard with rain, okay? Low elevation areas as well as, high elevation areas. There's a trend there, but it's one way to deal with that, to push further evaluation of the rainfall data, is to convert that rainfall into something called runoff, which is to say for a catchment of a certain size, there's a certain amount of rain, and you normalize that by the area of the catchment, okay? So that would be in terms of like millimeters per square kilometer. And what we see there is a pattern emerges. It's not exactly, as nice as we'd like, but what we see is this positive increase with elevation. So higher elevation sites, you've got a lot of variation here, but there tends to be an increase in rainfall, so runoff with elevation. So one might say, okay, if this were the data I had, I might predict that there's more disturbance, if you will, at higher elevations because there's more rainfall per unit area. Okay. Now again, that's sort of dodgy in terms of an actual mechanistic explanation, but that's one way of thinking about it. The other way is to look at, and because we had pre and post data, we had actually taken photographs of all of our sites at along a 100-meter, reach of stream, all four directions at every, 20 meters. So we had really good sort of pictures of the channel structure, knowing, of course, that there was going to be a massive disturbance in 3 years. But we had those data. And so what we could do is we could repeat the photographic approach, and we could take pictures before and after of all of our sites and compare them, and developed a simple little, rating tool to how much disturbance based on a scale of 0 to 1. Okay. And we had a couple people do this with pretty good convergence in the values. And so that's what we went with. And what we see here is that this value can range from 0 to 1, and this is 0.2. So not strong channel movement. It's at 30 high elevation, 3,000 meters. Here's another one at even higher elevation. We see, again, based on our photographs, a low channel disturbance. So these high elevation streams seem to have a low channel disturbance. These are characteristic. The low elevation streams, by contrast, here's one at 22,000 meters, was pretty heavily disturbed, okay, as was another sort of the most disturbed site, this Black Canyon, which was really reamed out. I mean, it was just devastated by this flood. Has a channel disturbance index of 1. So we have across this gradient. And a point I want to make here and come back to, because it's really interesting. One of the sort of the more interesting things I learned from this project. So we have below 2,500 meters elevation, we have the sort of low channel disturbance, whereas above we have high channel disturbance. No, sorry, I said the opposite, didn't I? At high elevation, we have low disturbance, and at low elevation, we have high disturbance. Okay, why would that be? Okay, when they all received roughly the same amount of rain, and the runoff showed that maybe there should be higher disturbance at high elevation, but this channel movement is showing just the opposite pattern: higher disturbance at low elevation. So that's a fun mystery, which I hope we solved. Okay, so across this range of 14 sites, we basically have a channel disturbance gradient that looks like this, really strong correlation. And interestingly, again, we look at that 2,500 meter break, we have sort of this group, low elevation, high disturbance compared to high elevation, low disturbance. It's a pretty clear break. So that's pretty intriguing, and not the kind of, sort of unique kind of data because of this, we were able to do this pre and post study on so many streams. All right. Okay, so in terms of the results, we have this sort of, two different kinds of predictions of disturbance, and we're going to go with this one, channel disturbance across elevation. So the predictions, first, that taxa will decline. That's a pretty straightforward prediction. We look at all the taxa, we see there's a strong decline in all taxa in terms of proportion persisting across this gradient. Okay, strong relationship. So the greater the disturbance, fewer taxa persist. There's good. We're reassured by that sort of basic ecological prediction, right? That's what we found. Secondly, taxa persist across the gradient will have greater resistance and resilience traits. And so just to remind you of these kinds of things, we're going to mostly look at these: low resistance, low resilience, and this group here, high resistance and high resilience. And it's confounded by the fact that this group has adults and this group doesn't. Okay, so we're sort of combining mobility traits and adults in this group. That's the hand that nature dealt us. And if we look at them as sort of, there are two groups: the immobile group with no adults. We see there's generally low persistence across this disturbance gradient. They're all being hammered. It doesn't really matter what the disturbance level is. It's exceeded some threshold, even if it's a 1 in 50-year event, to really hammer these low mobility taxa, only 25% persisting. Okay. By contrast with the high mobility taxa with adults, what we see is, first of all, there's a much higher average persistence, 84% across this whole group. And there's also a decline in taxa that lack these resistance and resilience traits the only ones that survive at these really high resistance, high disturbance levels are those that have really sort of hyped up on resistance and resilience traits. Okay. So we have a very clear contrast between these two groups of insects. And here's some pictures. We see that these were lost from almost all the sites. These taxa had no adults. Interestingly, we went back and sampled the following year for some of these sites, and these taxa weren't even present in the second year. So it was a very serious event in terms of potential longer term consequences. Persisted at all, but the most extreme sites, these mobile taxa with adults, and then at the most extreme sites, even others persisted were these highly mobile mayflies, the simulids, which could potentially recover by drifting from upstream, and then these uncrushable helmets. Okay, so we see some patterns that make sense, right, in terms of how we've characterized the data. Now, for the third part of the study, which involved more of my collaborators and myself, we had predicted that for species that do persist, we would expect mortality having caused population decline of those persisting taxa, and there might be a demographic bottleneck that would result in some change in allele frequencies or loss in genetic richness. And so this is for 6 taxa, right, that we collected pre and post. So these are neutral loci, not under selection, so we had some confidence in the inferences. Here were our techniques that were used in 2013, 14. Many of you will recognize these techniques. I'm not going to read them off. Okay. Response variables, where we looked at a change in allelic richness. So the richness of alleles before minus the richness of alleles post, adjusted for the pre-data. And we looked at the change in allele frequencies for populations, and we call this flood FST. So it's the pairwise FST values between pre and post flood samples for each population across the streams. Okay. And I'll go through these results. First, let me say, so here we have, first of all, we have our 3 drainages here. So the spatial variation here is not really that important. Okay, we're not going to focus on that. What we're looking at more importantly is this pre and post. So the dark color is the pre-allele diversity. It's a PCA graph, and the post is the after. And what we see is that these whether it's blue, green, red, or blue drainage, there's not much temporal variation in the allelic richness. You see that? It's all sort of overlapping. Same for this species. And here's a pretty messy one here, but we're not seeing a lot of temporal divergence, okay? Now, for some species, we saw more. For example, this Baetis tricaudatus had a fair amount of pre and post divergence. And there was some for this stonefly as well. So there's an increase in variation after the disturbance, interestingly, okay? And I'll come back to that in just a moment. So what would we expect? What do we predict? That there would be a loss of allelic richness and in populations across the sites, and some divergences in response to flood magnitude. So what we see here for the proportion changed allelic richness, this one is hidden right up here, is a positive, very strong positive. That's that one I showed you that has all this variation, Baetis tricaudatus. The others had decreased allelic richness. These did, but one had an increased allelic richness. In terms of the change in heterozygosity, sort of the diversity of alleles, we saw, again, one taxon, that interesting one, had an increase in heterozygosity, okay? And then in terms of temporal change, we saw several responding, most of them sort of mildly, but again, our one taxon, this mayfly, Baetis tricaudatus, scored high, or had increases in all of these metrics. And what was sort of intriguing to me, so we have variable responses, but this one taxon seems to be standing out somehow for some reason, okay? If you look at the ecological traits of this Baetis tricaudatus here, with its genetically sister species, Baetis bicaudatus, we see that they're, in terms of ecological traits, they're the same. So this is pretty, it's really points to an interesting question, about how well could we predict things like resilience of species from just ecological traits, when even sister species have that are ecologically trait similar, have very different genomic responses. Now it's a small sample size, it's one study, but it's an interesting result. All right, so towards wrapping up, here's back our study area, and this idea that we have sort of hydrologic gradient going on, which sort of is corresponding somehow to our disturbance gradient. But if we calculate the disturbance again, we see that below 2,500 and above 2,500, these disturbances are high and low elevation down here, and low and high elevation. Now, I'm just a stream ecologist. I go out and I try to measure, substrate size and geomorphological things, but I couldn't understand, this just didn't make sense because something, was happening. And then I came across this really interesting paper. So here we are, Rocky Mountains, right here, Colorado. I live, Fort Collins is right in here, our city area, right at the boundary of the Colorado Front Range and the Great Plains. And of course, the Great Plains is this vast grassland, right? It's like the Serengeti, which used to have buffalo in it. But, it's very flat, relatively flat compared to the Colorado Rockies. And I came across this interesting paper that was published. Some of my colleagues at the university said, oh, there's been proposed to be a geologic discontinuity in the mountains at about 2,500 meters. I thought, what's that, So I found this paper in a geological science journal that describes this. So the Great Plains, is relatively flat and it's pretty erosible. So these sediments are eroding and the streams are cutting back up, towards the mountains. And they hit this sort of hard crystalline rock, at the base of the mountains and start cutting into it to carve canyons, right? And as the canyons carve, we're talking about geologic time now, okay? As these canyons carve, that lowers the base level of the outlet of the mountain rivers, right? And so those small tributary streams upstream begin to head cut. It's like gully formation, okay? And so there's this geologic instability. As canyons cut, the base level is lowered, and mountain streams erode upstream catchments to adjust to the new base level. And that upstream cutting has, to this point, proceeded to about 2,500 meters in elevation across this Front Range domain. So the upshot is that those channels that are in 2,500 meters or lower are highly unstable in sort of geologic time and geomorphically, and they tend to erode more rapidly and more dynamically than those that are above 2,500 meters. And that's, for me, that's an explanation. That's sort of a pretty cool thing that I learned about this project. And it's interesting, I've been working in the Colorado Rockies for, my graduate work and then for 25 years since then. And I thought I understood the disturbance regimes in this system. Mostly, snow melt, occasionally get a big snow melt year, at lower elevations, you get these monsoonal rainstorms, that occur once every, who knows, 50 to 100 years. And then this event came along, this extreme event, rainfall in the fall. And what we found was totally unexpected, not unexpected in terms of the ecological responses, but just in terms of, the the effect of this rainfall is probably more important in sort of driving, evolutionary change or, ecosystem function for periods of years than the snowmelt streams, the snowmelt does. And so there's this disturbance regime, which has not been captured before across this domain, which really is not snowmelt, but is extreme rainfall. And I guess, with climate change and, increasing, well, we're supposed to get drier, but you never know, could have more intense storms. This one came up from the Gulf of, from south of Baja, California, Baja, Mexico. So, I think we learned a fair amount about what this event meant. And we also were surprised. So we learned, we validated some ecological theory for the system, and that was good. I think one really important take-home point here is that the timing of this event relative to the life history stage of the organisms was really critical. A month later, had this event occurred, a lot of those insects would have been, they would have not been present on the stream bank, okay, because it's getting colder. And so, that is a take-home message that occurs that's relevant to almost any system, right? So organisms with life cycles, their life cycles are differentially vulnerable to particular kinds of extreme events. And so we found that, here having adults on the bank was probably the most important factor. So the genomics data revealed that there was some evolutionary change, but the patterns were sort of, I would say, they were idiosyncratic. But that one interesting result is that ecologically similar species can have surprisingly different resilience abilities as measured in terms of, allelic richness pre and post. Okay. As it turns out, we haven't really investigated this closely, but the one that has the high resilience, Abatis trichodatus, also tends to have a boundary of about 2,500 meters in its distribution. It's more of a warm water, lower elevation. So whether that, is relevant or not, it's interesting. Finally, measuring disturbance the right way is really important. And you've got to get at the mechanism that's actually causing mortality. And I think we did that by looking at this channel disturbance. Okay. And finally, it's underlying landscape stability. We call it this geomorphology is a context for understanding local biological responses to extreme flows. And that was totally, news to me and gave me a whole new perspective on how these systems operate in the montane region of Colorado and probably other places as well. So with that, I'd like to thank my colleague, my co-authors, and NSF for funding this work. And I'd be happy to take any questions you might have. Thank you.
Questions? Richard. I was just wondering the syncretic responses of the genomic responses that you saw across the species. Did you have a sense of that could also be related to the timing of things? So you could imagine one that recolonized and increases electric pressures, just having the adults in the landscape at the time of the period recolonizing.
You're going to have to sort of distill that question just a little bit for me. I didn't quite catch all that.
Sorry. You have syncretic responses of genomic responses.
Yeah.
Did you have a sense that could be linked to the timing of life history traits as well? So it just happens that one species was present in the landscape as adults at the time of the events that could recolonize, retain some.
Yeah, I mean, well, we don't have enough data to actually do that, but that one sort of very weedy, mobile, recolonizing species, it turns out that we had another paper that looked at sort of the genetic similarities of those two species across the elevation ranges. And that species tends to, the one that tends to be at low elevation, tends to be more mixed, like it's moving more than, yeah. And so, yeah, that would be the answer, I think, to your question. So, and because they're at lower elevation, they tend to have maybe 3 generations per year, as opposed to just 2, like the other one. So, there could be, there's probably something there, but we can't pull it out from this. Yeah.
So Dwayne would love your comment about geomorphology. It's one of the
Oh yeah.
very
Thank you.
one of the things that's extraordinary lack
Yeah,
My thought on categorizing the disturbance stuff was, if you look at sediment size, the high elevation stuff only has big rocks. Big rocks are much harder to shift than little rocks. And so, whereas when you be on the lowlands, of course, it's far more fine sediments, which get moved really, really easily. To me, it makes sense that the lowland stuff will have way more disturbance to the stream bed than the upland stuff. So maybe there's a way of looking at that from a sediment size perspective.
yeah, what we did,
Yeah.
no, I think that's a good point, but I think those photos are a little bit misleading in that respect as well. I got really excited about trying to estimate whether the sediment would move at a site. Okay, and so we bought some equipment and we like lasered in the width of the channel based on the debris lines, that had been left by the flood, so we could measure the slope of the bed and the particle size in the bed. We could actually calculate shear stress at each of the locations and see whether or not there was excess shear stress that could be, across this elevation gradient. And it converged more on the, I have to go chase that down, but it wasn't as explanatory in terms of the response as the channel disturbance. But I think there was more of an overlap there was a less of a relationship with elevation. But I deleted that at the last minute. So that's a fair point. It's a fair point. And so, yeah, I don't know.
We might stop it there just because we